Hey, welcome to a Hands Across the Anglosphere edition of the Mark Steyn Show. I've never seen more news about Australia in the American press than in the last couple of days. No, not even in the days of the great Don Bradman. And you Americans will have to go and look that up. We are privileged at this time of interest in Aussie-American relations to be joined today not by the longest serving Prime Minister in Australian history, that's Sir Robert Menzies, and he can't be with us, but the great John Howard is with us direct from Sydney, and we'll be talking to him in just a moment. The current Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, spoke with the new US President just a couple of days ago, and it didn't go well. Donald Trump called it the worst call of the day. And that includes Angela Merkel, with whom he'd had a fairly frosty telephone call just a couple of hours earlier. The subject of the disagreement was the deal by which Australia persuaded the Obama administration to take 1,250 so-called refugees off its hands. In other words, these are 1,250 people who tried to get into Australia, and Australia said they're not good enough to come to Australia, and then they persuaded Barack Obama to take them instead. Donald Trump fumed over this in his conversation with Malcolm Turnbull and demanded to know why Mr. Turnbull was basically exporting the next Boston bombers to the United States, which is a hell of a line. It was supposed to be a one-hour conversation. Trump had had enough after 25 minutes, and the call ended. And thereafter began a lot of leaking. My understanding is that it, in fact, was neither the Australian Prime Minister's office nor the US President's office that leaked the fractious phone call, but the State Department. In other words, the American bureaucracy yet again deciding that it is at war with the new president it's supposed to be serving. At any rate, for the current position, pay no attention to ambassadors or foreign ministers or State Department diplomats. Instead, follow the tweet. On September 11th, 2001, my next guest happened to be in the United States on an official visit from Australia. A few days later, he returned down under and told the Australian people that this was no time to be an 80% ally. And in the years that followed, he was not an 80% ally. He was a great friend to the American-Australian alliance, the longest-serving Prime Minister in Australian history, with the exception of the legendary Sir Robert Menzies. It's a pleasure to welcome the Honourable John Howard, OMAC. And I should have said John Winston Howard, because you're actually, I knew a lot of kids when I was growing up. Every other boy in the British West Indies was named Winston or Spencer. But you were actually named after Winston Churchill before almost anybody else was.
Oh, well, I'm not sure before anybody else, but it is true that my parents gave me that middle name in July of 1939, and that was, of course, before Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain in the dark days of World War II and gave that extraordinary leadership to the free world that saved it from the horrors of Nazi tyranny and domination.
So were your parents big admirers of Churchill even when he was in the political wilderness?
Certainly my father was. I'm not saying my mother wasn't, but my father, who was a veteran of World War I, admired or agreed with what Churchill was saying in the middle 1930s when the great man warned that appeasement would end in tears and end in disaster, and encouraged the free world to do something about combating Nazism and fascism before it got a hold. And sadly, as we know from history, if his advice had been taken earlier, we almost certainly would have been spared the dreadful destruction of life and treasure in World War II.
Well, the Churchill bust is now back in the Oval Office. When I was in Australia about this time last year, you were, it's no big secret, you were no big fan of Donald Trump. You said you trembled at the thought of him in the Oval Office. You've warmed up to him a little bit since then, I think.
Well, I will pay on results. I did say some critical things about him before the election, and I don't withdraw those comments. They were my genuine reactions to the comments that he'd made and some of the attitudes he'd struck. But he has become the President of the United States. It's the most powerful position in the world. It's in everybody's interest that he succeed, and I think it's very important to have the world accept the result. It was done democratically. It was against most of the predictions and against a lot of odds, and in the teeth of criticism from his own party as well as from his Democratic rivals. And I will take the view that his term in the presidency will be judged according to what he does with it, not according to what he said beforehand. And I think the other thing to understand about Donald Trump is that having got to the White House using what many people regard as unconventional methods and a different approach,
Right.
he's not likely to think the approach he's taken was wrong.
No.
He's likely to be saying to himself, well, they were all wrong. I knew what I was doing. I got here. I beat the odds. And I will now do what I promised I would do. And I think we have to give him time. I think we have to treat as nothing these knee-jerk demonstrations and responses. They're just the disgruntled outcry of people who lost a prize that they took for granted.
Well, a lot of Australian Conservatives have not warmed up to him. People who one would expect are traditionally supporters of the American Republican Party. They're not quite on board with this. And at the moment, the American papers, I've never seen coverage of Australian affairs like there's been in the last couple of days, not even at the time of the monarchy referendum or other Australian events. This, in a sense, one tweet by Donald Trump overruled statements by the embassy in Canberra, by the State Department, by the official reports of the Trump-Turnbull conversation. Is this just a little tempest in a teacup, or is it something more than that?
Well, there's nothing new, Mark, about a clear statement from the man at the top overruling other interpretations. Now, whether it's done by a tweet or whether it's done in a television interview or whether in a written statement, it's always been the case that if the President says something that puts a different spin on things, then that alters the coverage and alters the interpretation. I think one of the things you've got to understand is that a number of the positions that Donald Trump took during the election campaign and has taken since were not in line with the free market philosophy of people on the centre right of politics, either in the United States, in Canada, Australia, or the United Kingdom. I mean, the party I led for 16 years, the Liberal Party of Australia, centre right party, was very much a supporter of open trade and open markets. Now, the abandonment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership by the new president, he's entitled to do what he's done because he promised that he would do that. But it's not consistent with the approach that centre-right parties have previously taken. Not incidentally was his position any different from that of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, of course, changed her ground. Right. She started off supporting it, and then when the messages started coming from the Democratic Party base in certain battleground states, she shifted her position. So you can understand why in a number of areas, people on the centre-right of politics have taken a critical attitude to Donald Trump. But we have to allow the whole thing to work its way through. We have to allow people to see him in action for a number of months, and he himself, of course, has got to experience the daily pressures of the office. One of the biggest challenges you have in politics when you arrive in a position of great power, and he's certainly experienced that, is to make the transition. Some people make the transition very well, some people don't make it at all well.
Right. Well, you made an interesting observation, just to go back to that trade issue. A few months ago, you said that Australia has basically one of the biggest middle classes in the world. It's a very middle-class country.
That's correct.
By comparison, America in recent decades, the middle class has shrunk. And in a sense, it's been bifurcating into people who do enormously well and then formerly middle-class people whose children are now being forced into minimum wage service jobs. And isn't this Trump running on a kind of anti-globalist platform to do with the fact that free trade as understood in the last 20 years has been no friend of the American middle class?
Well, I think there's an element of truth in that. I think that Trump has responded to the unhappiness of people who have lost their jobs because of the downgrading of manufacturing industry in certain parts of the United States. Now, that is a perfectly understandable thing. There's nothing new about people being unhappy if trade arrangements cost them jobs. We hear this word populism flung around with gay abandon.
No.
The truth is that there's always been populism. It's just the modern word for the understandable discontent of those who've lost their jobs and lost their economic security. That's a perfectly legitimate thing for people to do, and one of the challenges that all political parties have, whether they're centre-right or centre-left, is to understand that there are some casualties of globalisation, to have the capacity to find alternative jobs for those people, hard though it is, but also have the capacity to explain that just as there are some people who lose out, there are a lot more people who gain. And if you look at the entire world, over the past 20 years, open trade, competitive capitalism and globalisation have lifted more people out of poverty than at any time in the last 100 years. Now that's cold comfort if you are an unemployed steel worker in the middle west of the United States. I understand that, and Donald Trump understands that, and I think the Democrats now understand it. But part of the challenge for modern political parties is to rediscover the art of persuasion and advocacy. And you can't do that unless you have a proper understanding of what has happened, but also have a capacity to explain to people, yes, that may have happened, but on the other hand, the number of people living in absolute poverty in other parts of the world has dramatically fallen in the last 15 or 20 years in a way that people would never have thought possible even 10 years ago.
Well, let's just unpack that a bit, because the current row in Australian-American relations is connected to illegal immigration, which Trump ran on as part of his platform. He wants to build a wall on the Mexican border, and he doesn't see why millions and millions of unskilled workers should flood into the United States from the third world. Australia, under your leadership and since, has had one of the most restrictive immigration policies in the world. Everybody on the planet who isn't Australian needs a visa to visit Australia. You have a policy that if people attempt to arrive by boat, which is really the equivalent of the Mexican-Latin American tide, if they attempt to arrive in Australia by boat. You won't let them set foot on Australian territory. In a sense, Donald Trump and a lot of other leaders in Western nations would like to have the immigration policy for their countries that Australia has.
Yeah, I understand that. The important thing to remember about Australia is we certainly apply strict rules in relation to people who are trying to come here, but the net result is we have high levels of immigration, and the immigration is on a completely non-discriminatory basis. But we just say that, in effect, and I encapsulated it many years ago in an election campaign when I said we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. Now, that was not pulling up the drawbridge. It was simply saying if you want to come to Australia, you've got to do it in an orthodox, open, transparent manner. You can't come here in an illegal, unauthorised way, and if you try to do that, you won't be allowed to stay in the place or ever come back to the place. Now, most Australians support that, and my experience has been that the firmer and more regulated immigration policy is, the higher the level of domestic support for immigration. We continue to have a very high number of migrants each year coming to Australia. We also have quite a genuine, generous refugee program, but we insist that everybody follows the rules. And can I tell you that the great majority of Australians support that approach? When I first stood for that kind of an approach, something like 16 or 17 years ago, I was attacked as racist by many people on the other side of politics. Many people in the world media attacked us and said it was wrong, and now in the fullness of time, many people have come to accept and realise that the approach we adopted made a lot of sense. Now, the question of whether what Donald Trump is doing is the same or some variant or whatever, I'll leave that to those who are involved in the debate in the United States. As I understand it, the executive orders he's issued impose temporary prohibitions. They don't read to me or sound to me like they're permanent prohibitions, but he is clearly trying to deliver on what he said he would do, but I'll leave that to the domestic debate in the United States. Our position is clear. We are open to migrants from all around the world, irrespective of their race, religion or nationality, but they've got to come through the front door, and they've got to have all the boxes ticked before they're allowed to settle. But
just to look at it as part of a global trend, I mean, it is the case that, for example, Brexit, the decision of United Kingdom voters to leave the European Union, was driven in part by the feeling that they'd lost control of their borders. If you look at what Angela Merkel is going through in Germany, the rise of Marine Le Pen in France, the political consensus on the centre-left has been essentially that if there's 6 billion people who are in the developing world, and if they can get to your countries, they can stay in your countries. Angela Merkel, they're pushing back against that. In France, Monsieur Hollande has been deemed unelectable because his government said you just have to get used to people blowing up things. In the United States, the Democrats are essentially demonstrating at airports, even against modest prohibitions for unverifiable people from failed states, such as Yemen and Libya and Somalia and so on. Is there a global movement throughout the Western world tying all these phenomena together?
Well, I don't think it's a global movement as such. But, Mark, no country can, for any length of time, accept any number of migrants, irrespective of their population, their economic circumstances and the like. The idea that you can have uncontrolled borders is just so unrealistic. And this has been the reason why there's been a reaction in many countries around the world. Now, you mentioned Brexit. Now, obviously, migration was part of it. I mean, if I had been British, which of course I wasn't and not, I'd have voted to leave the European Union. I thought the European Union was a very bad deal for the United Kingdom. And it's a flawed concept fundamentally. Right. But on top of that, there was a massive loss of sovereignty involved in British membership of the European Union. There's no way the British could ever control migration into that country while their country remained a member of the European Union. And the world is witnessing at the moment the application of something that we've tended to put in discard for too long, and that is the concept that the nation state is still the principle, the major organising principle of world affairs. This idea that you hand over sovereignty to some kind of international bureaucracy which is full of wisdom and full of grace and full of capacity to solve the world's problems is quite false. And I think you are seeing around the world not something that's new, but a fairly old idea, going back to the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century, right. That the nation state is the organising principle of world affairs. By all means, have bodies like the United Nations and the IMF. By all means, nations should cooperate. Some nations will be friendlier with each other than others. But at the end of the day, every country has a right to determine its own destiny, provided it doesn't do it in a way that hurts or damages the interests of other countries.
Well, I remember something you said to me about a decade ago. It was around the time of the launch of the Iraq War. And if you recall, Mr. Bush, Mr. Blair and Mr. Aznar had a big photo op, I think it was in the Azores or the Canary Islands or somewhere.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and you hadn't bothered flying in for that. You said, I don't need to be part of the photo op. And Australia's position, it has formal alliances, but basically it's an ally of the United States, not because you belong to NATO, which Australia does not because you belong to a supranational body like the European Union, but Australia makes its alliances where it has mutually compatible interests. That's very different from forcing yourself into a 28-member bloc where we have to pretend that Ireland has something in common with countries that were communist until 20 years ago. Isn't Australia's behaviour, in a sense, the way all sovereign nations used to behave until a couple of years ago?
I think to some extent it is. I mean, we have a close alliance militarily with the United States. That's based on history, it's based on the reality that American power in World War II was the thing that stood before or in front of a Japanese invasion of Australia, and Australians have never forgotten that. But the other thing is that we have common values, common attitudes with the United States, as indeed we do with Canada and New Zealand and the United Kingdom, the nations of the so-called Anglosphere. We in fact share a head of state with those particular countries, not the Americans of course, but it makes sense that we would have an alliance with the United States, but it also makes sense that we have a very intimate and very productive and valuable trading relationship with countries like China and Japan and Korea. China is our best export destination. Japan is our second best. We have very close relations with all of these countries in our own region, and we have harmonious military cooperation with them, but of course the character of the relationship at a military level is much closer and more intimate with the Americans. And then very significantly, in a world that lives with a terrorist threat, we have the so-called Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement, whereby the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia and New Zealand share at the highest possible level our intelligence products. And timely intelligence is the best antidote to terrorism known the man. And that is an intensely valuable and important linkage.
Well, let me ask you about that. As you pointed out, 4 of those 5 eyes have the same head of state, Her Majesty the Queen. You know a bit about playing a sticky wicket in defence of Her Majesty the Queen in the monarchy referendum in Australia. So 4 of the 5 eyes have the same head of state. The 5th member, the United States, is in this temporary 2-century rebellion against the Crown, but it'll be back on the team sooner or later.
I don't think it's very temporary.
It will be. You never know. I'm taking the long. I'm taking the long view here. Let me ask you about that. These are regarded as, most people would say, oh, these are antiquated relationships. This is a hangover of empire. In the end, Australia's key relationships are with Indonesia, China, or whatever. You can have a trading relationship, but in the end, when you want to share intelligence, when you want to be standing alongside a man when you go to war, there are more primal connections, aren't there?
Well, there are, but I don't want to downplay, if you look back in history, the extraordinary volunteer contribution of our Indian friends on the side of the Allies in World War II.
No.
When the armies surrendered to the Japanese in Singapore, as well as Australians and British and New Zealanders going into captivity, a lot of Indians did as well. Yeah. And the Indian volunteer effort in World War II was quite remarkable. But there is a difference between nations that have shared values, shared history, shared tradition, and nations that just had shared economic interests. And most Australians are astute enough to know the difference, and it's the objective of Australian foreign policy to keep all of those friendships and associations in good repair. When I was Prime Minister, I saw no conflict between having an even closer relationship with the United States than we had when I started, and it was very close then, and also building a very close relationship with China, always recognising, of course, that China was a different society. China is a totalitarian country, it's a communist state, it doesn't have the transparency and the rule of law that we have in Australia, and operates in Canada and the US and Britain, but you live and let live. And you don't spend your time lecturing other countries as to how they ought to alter their system. You try and focus on the things that you have in common.
You say live and let live. You worked in close partnership with George W. Bush. At his second inaugural, he gave a speech essentially promising to plant American-style liberty throughout the Middle East. He ran initially as someone who wasn't into nation building, and then he found himself building schoolhouses throughout Afghanistan. He found himself governing Iraq as a somewhat fractious colony, and you were by his side all that time. As you look back on that immediate post 9/11 period, do you think we all assumed that it was easier than in fact it has turned out?
Well, I guess that applies to every military engagement that nations have ever got involved in. They always turn out over time to be more arduous and less popular and more highly criticised than they are at the very beginning. I think in relation to Afghanistan and Iraq, that certainly applied. I've said before that I stand by very strongly the participation of Australia in the original military operation in Iraq. I think there was a mistake made in disbanding the Iraqi army and the police afterwards. And I think there was also a very big mistake after the very successful surge was undertaken under General David Petraeus that the following American administration so quickly withdrew American involvement. Now that is a long and separate story.
Right.
If the point of your question is, wasn't that an example of really not living and let living? I think that's the point you're getting at. Yeah. Look, you can argue that, but I'm talking about the policy that my government pursued in relation to trade with nations in our part of the world that didn't necessarily have the same democratic system of government, namely China. Now, we have a good relationship with China, but we shouldn't be mesmerised by it. China is still authoritarian, and China still faces a huge demographic challenge as the years go by. But consistent with our national interest, we should continue to have a realistic but close relationship with the Chinese.
You had a little bit of a problem with them at one point where China seemed to be trying to subvert offshore islands, a few British colonies that had been come to independence in the 70s and 80s, and China was kind of monkeying around with them. And you made that problem go away relatively easily, just sending in a few advisors to governments in the Solomon Islands and other places. Is it, when you look at what happened in Iraq, when you look at what happened in Afghanistan, America isn't a very good imperialist, and America doesn't seem to really want to impose its values on other societies. And there's a contradiction there, isn't there? Can you really have an effective 15-year intervention?
In fairness to the Americans, you've got to make allowance for the American state of mind immediately after the 11th of September. Although nobody seriously argued that Iraq had been involved in the September 11 attacks, there was no evidence that I ever saw suggesting that, and I don't ever remember President Bush arguing that that was the case. But there was a feeling in the United States that there would be another attack, and it was a question of when and where rather than if. And in those circumstances, the fear that a nation that might have weapons of mass destruction would give those to terrorists was very real. Now, in the fullness of time, no stockpiles of those weapons were found, but context is everything when nations and leaders take decisions, and I think you have to understand the American mentality at that time, not just being one of naked imperialism, but a real feeling of vulnerability. It's always a mistake to assume that because the United States is a very powerful country, it never suffers feelings of vulnerability.
Yeah, Donald Trump has basically disowned Bush-era foreign policy, and he said he's not interested in neoconservative adventurism.
Let's wait and see.
Yeah.
Let's wait and see.
You're not worried that he's...
I don't get too hung up on labels and theories. Let us wait and see. It's a different era, and everybody has got to govern according to the era in which they operate.
Well, just as a final question, I mentioned that you're the second longest serving Australian Prime Minister of all time. And that didn't seem such a big deal a few years ago. But since you left office, Australian Prime Ministers are basically in office for 20 minutes and then boom, they're gone and there's another one along tomorrow. There's been, I think, 4 since you left office, and a couple of them back and forth, in and out, in and out. Are you worried that Australia has become harder, or at any rate the Australian Parliament has become harder to govern since you left office?
Well, certainly we've had a big turnover of Prime Ministers. That can't be denied. I'm not certain that that represents a permanent change. Sometimes after you've had very lengthy periods of government by one person or by one group of person, you will get an unsettled period. And this applies particularly in a parliamentary system where leaders don't have fixed terms. Now, I'm not criticising the parliamentary system. I happen to think a parliamentary system is far, far better than a presidential system. But the presidential system guarantees that, apart from impeachment, and that doesn't happen very often, once somebody's elected to the presidency, he or she stays in that position for 4 years.
Right.
I would say it's too early to suggest that there's been the introduction of a, how shall I put it, permanent volatility. That's a contradiction in terms in Prime Ministers in Australia. I don't think we're going to see in the next few years what we've seen in the last 4 or 5.
The stability of instability, impermanence as a permanent feature. One other point too, just to go back to that 80% ally. You stood shoulder to shoulder with George W. Bush in the days after 9/11, when other people began wobbling very quickly, the French and others. Are we where you thought we would be in the pushback against radical Islamic terrorism, or are they further ahead than they should be? In other words, did you think this would all have been wrapped up by now, or are we basically where you thought we would be 15 years in?
I think that's almost impossible to answer, because there have been so many changes in context and circumstances. The Arab Spring was not something that I thought was necessarily going to occur. I think the extreme violence and terror of ISIS is not something that we contemplated quite to the same degree as has turned out to be the case. I think they're the sort of questions that are almost impossible to answer. The one observation I'd make is that one of the most important things that countries like Australia and the United States must do is never to lose an intense self-belief in the value of our own traditions and the value of our culture.
Yeah.
I think a declining self-belief on the part of Western countries in the value and the attraction of Western civilization is one of the more disturbing developments. And if we really want to maintain the strength of our resistance to extremism, Islamic extremism, then we have to maintain a very strong defence and a very deep faith in the value of Western liberal civilization. Thank you.
Amen, amen to that. Civilizational self-confidence. That's what we all want. It's always great to hear from you. The Honourable John Howard, OMAC. One day I'll tell you what those stand for. And the next time we have John on the show, he can explain why the British, Canadian, and New Zealand Prime Ministers are all styled the Right Honourable, and Australia's Prime Minister John Howard is the Honourable. He can that's a bit of British Commonwealth arcana, but John will explain that the next time he's on the show. It's great to see you, and we hope to see you over on this side of the Atlantic very soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's show. We will see you next time.